Have you been considering the Heliana's Guide to Monster Hunting crafting rules, but you don't know if they'll fit into your campaign, or you're just not really sure what the whole deal is in the first place? Irrelevant, I'm going to be discussing them here today and also talking about the kind of campaign they do and don't fit into and whether or not I like them. I mean, I do like them. That's pretty obvious. I think I've mentioned that before, but I'll explain why I like them. This is going to be a little bit different to my standard review videos because I'm not going to be going everything in huge detail purely because these rules are complicated, which is the first hurdle I think a lot of people are going to come across. I'll show you. On D&D Beyond, this is what you're greeted with when you open up the Heliana's Book 1 book, and as you can see there's a lot here, along with instructions on, the classes, which we've talked about before, as well as the species. There are some really cool ones, and then multiple different hunts, specific hunts. There's 6 of them. Well, it's more like mini adventures, I guess, but they are hunts, which is I like a lot. And then there's also a list of different creatures, as well as the item component index, which talks about what you can make from different items, which is huge. It's not really a downside, but the only downside of this book is that it only lists the items in itself and also in the DMG, which means that you have to do a little bit of homebrewing, basically, if you want to bring in other sources, like the Griffin's Saddle book, for example. This is not the end of the world. It's relatively easy to do, and it goes over a lot of the balance in the actual rules itself, which is always a nice thing, especially if you're somebody that does like to mix and match third-party stuff. It's something to keep in mind. It's very much not a detriment of the book itself. Ultimately, you can't expect this book to have item recipes for every single item in existence, especially ones that are released after, but it's something worth noting. I'm going to have a quick overview of the harvesting and the crafting rules, and I do mean quick, because to understand them properly, it does take a few reads, or at least it does for me. That might just be a skill issue on my part. The harvesting rules are obviously what you need to know about first. Long and short is that different components you can harvest from monsters have different DCs, and then you need one person to be kind of middle managing them and one person to actually be harvesting the creature. There are rules as to how long after a creature has died you can do this, as well as the size of the creature and how long it will take. And basically, the more components you pick, the more that DC stacks up. So let's say you end up with a DC of 50 total check between the two characters, and the type of check specific will change based on the kind of creature it is, which I really, really like. You will then end up with some of those, all of those if you succeed all of them, but you won't lose all of them if you don't succeed on all of them. So let's say you've got a 5, 10 and a 15, so that would be a 30 total DC, and the players would then list those in the order that they would like to get them, and then the DCs would have kind of stop points, checkpoints as it were. So if they roll 25, for example, but they listed that the component that has a DC of 5 isn't last, then they'll get that one and they'll miss out on the 10 or the 15, depending on how they ordered things. It's a lot. There's a lot going on here. It kind of has to be to make it interesting, and I really do like it. There's also, along with specific lists, it also tells you how many of components are available from each creature, which is great. There's also rules for the specifics. One of my favorite optional rules is the damage type ruling, which is that if you finish off a monster with acid, fire, and necrotic damage, basically, that it would potentially ruin components. I also like if you get someone to describe how they finish off a monster and they describe destroying a specific part, obviously they can't harvest that part anymore. A lot of this is up to the DM, as so many things are, but it's worth noting. Yeah. Along with the parts themselves, there's also essences. Essences you need to create some of the higher level items. You might need a frail essence to craft an uncommon item or a rare item, depending on the specific item you're building. There's prices associated with all of the items along with that, which is really, really great. Yeah, here we go. So frail essence is for uncommon, robust is for rare, and so on. And it's all dictated by the CR. We're very much limiting the power of the items your players can craft based on the CR you're throwing at them. I am a DM who regularly throws creatures that I probably shouldn't at my players, but I'm also a DM, as I've said previously, that likes giving out magic items, so it balances out. But it does mean that they'll generally be able to craft higher level gear than they would be able to otherwise. That's the basics of the harvesting rules. The crafting is technically split into 2 parts. So manufacturing and enchanting, but you can do it all at once as forging. The reasoning for this is that manufacturing is generally a more physical task, enchanting is a more magical one, and therefore only magical classes can do the enchanting. But if a non-magic class wants to craft something, they can do it with forging, where they do it all at the same time and imbue the magic from these parts into the weapons they're making. The example that the book gives is that if you want to make Flame Tongue Longsword, you first need to make a sword. So the first part of that would be manufacturing the Flame Tongue Longsword. Again, you need specific materials which have different costs, and you would also need specific abilities and tools. You can also hire people to do this, and if you hire experts to do this, it speeds the time up substantially. It goes over a rough idea of what you can make with each different tool set and also which stat would be best for those. It's very, very in-depth, as it needs to be due to the sheer volume of stuff that there is available to make. And it also gives a rough DC and manufacturing time as well. Look, it has to be a lot. Enchanting, you then basically smush the materials that you've gotten from monsters into these items to enchant them. Again, it lists the creature type that you got the item from, along with the skill that you would therefore need based on that. So for the Flame Tongue, if you were to enchant it, you need a longsword, you need the specific breath sac, you need a potent essence, you need to spend 320 hours, which is 40 work days, and you need a DC 21 spellcasting check using survival. It does say that the Flame Tongue is recalibrated to be a very rare item in this book, but obviously you can choose to keep that as a rare item if you so choose, and you could make that easier as a result. Forging, like I said, just smashes it all together. So you need all of the basic materials, and it takes the same amount of time, but you need 2 checks. The way that it then works within this is that if you succeed by a certain amount, you can add benefits to it, and if you fail by a certain amount, you might not make the item at all, or you might make it with flaws, like it forces attunement, things like that. That's a little hard to manage in D&D Beyond, but you can just do it with notes if you can't be bothered to homebrew stuff. That's not the end of the world. Something that I think is worth noting about all of this is that, let's get some image up. I just want to look at a nice picture while we're talking about stuff. Let's look at this cool thing. The key thing as to whether or not this will or will not fit into your campaign is essentially time. If you have a campaign where the players are constantly hitting the main story and there's very, very little downtime, and there are plenty of great stories like that, more linear or non-linear story progressions, but where there is a time factor involved, you're not going to have 40 days of time to devote to creating anything, and nor are you likely to find someone that can do that for you even within 20 days if you double it, for example. If, however, you're running a campaign where there is a lot of downtime, then this is a lot more achievable. There's also the matter of how common magic items and monsters are in your world. If you're running one where the concept of civilization is a little looser because there are more monsters out in the wild, and it's harder to buy magic items because of this, because they're constantly attacking, so that's something that you would need to factor in. Of course, if you're running a game like that and you do still want your players to have the chance to make magic items, you're also going to need to find ways to give them downtime. The best example I have for the downtime one would be the pirate campaign that I have currently postponed because one of the players has a kid. Congratulations to them. The pirate campaign innately has a lot of downtime when they're sailing around. You can't realistically, well, you can realistically give them something to do every 5 seconds if you want to, but they're on the high seas. They're not constantly getting attacked by monsters or other pirates. It happens here and there, and I do make them roll checks and stuff, but realistically there's a lot of time in which they're not doing anything, and while I could make them role play several days, I'm not going to. That is fun sometimes, but it's not fun all the time, right? As such, I really like these rules as a way to give the players something to do in their downtime. They're also naturally going on a lot of monster hunts because it's just fits into the campaign really, really well, and that makes these rules an incredibly good fit. I am still giving them my magic items here and there, as well as selling the magic items here and there, but my aim is to mostly give them stuff via the crafting rules. I also like this because it doesn't always make sense to me that a monster would have a bunch of items in its loot table, and having the players choose parts that they want to harvest and then the items they want to create from it gives the players a reward that isn't just items and isn't just leveling up. I understand that not every encounter needs to have a reward, but it's something that I like to do most of the time, and it means that the players can always get that feeling of progression from a session in both a story and a general mechanical sense. On the fewer magic items side of things, I'm running one that's inspired by the Crooked Moon books, mostly because the Crooked Moon books are incredible, and it would be very, very hard for me not to do that. And I might as well just do this. And this setting is one in which civilization is a lot more scattered than it would be in many other settings, and that's because there are just more monsters. There's also this constant threat of Druskenwald, which is the Crooked Moon setting, kind of invading. It's this mythos that permeates throughout all of these little societies, but because of this and because of the threat of genuinely like massive monsters just trampling stuff, rather than making one big city, civilizations have managed to eke out an existence by having several smaller outposts dotted around, along with slowly building up a railroad between them all. It doesn't have to make sense, it just has to be fun. This means that I cannot realistically put up magic shops in my setting. I don't mind messing around with the, what was it, similitude? I don't really mind messing around with my players' kind of buy-in of these things all the time. It's not the end of the world, but it is something I like to try to keep consistent when I can, and this is very much a situation in which I can do that. And because of that, the crafting rules fit in perfectly. It really helps that the Crooked Moon also has these big boss monsters that you can get legendary items from, so that's a really, really good fit there. But those two also encourage the idea of these budding adventurers who will get sucked into something bigger as the campaign goes on, and encourages them to learn more about survival and puts a bit more of a focus on that side of things. A lot of this just comes down to the fact that I really like the Monster Hunter series, and I really like games in which you can harvest parts and craft items. I think it's sick. Most of my players are video gamers. A lot of my players come from similar background to me, which means that we're all kind of in for this sort of thing. I don't think that the Heliana rules fit in every campaign, as I said, and I think it's perfectly reasonable if you don't want to use them in every campaign, but I really like having access to them so that I can try and factor them in when I am planning a campaign. If I don't want to tell a story where time is a huge factor, then this allows me to give the player something they can do with their downtime. And I think you can combine this really, really well with the Bastion system to add the idea of craftspeople to your Bastion as well, and maybe encourage the players to go back to a home base and build that up slowly, along with maybe using monster parts to create defenses. Again, a lot of this is going to be fairly homebrew inspired, but you know, that's a big part of the fun, right? But yes, so this is a rough kind of review of the Heliana's rules. I love them. I think they're very complicated. And I don't think they're very complicated. I think they're complicated enough, and I think it's for good reason, but I also think it does take a few reads to really wrap your head around, and also probably takes a couple attempts at running them. So I would recommend doing that with smaller groups before you hit your main campaign, or maybe in a couple of one-shots where you're just messing around with the systems. I adore Heliana's as a book. It's one of my favourites. It's up there with Griffin Sallow and The Crooked Moon for me. I will be doing a video on my favourite, maybe my top 5 30th third-party books on D&D Beyond soon. But yeah, that's it for this time. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.